I want to add the tender drawbar support bracket, as it's called in the instructions now, and this is where we risk undoing some of our good work, because this has got to attach to the rear spacer. So I've moved the frame assembly jig back onto the rear axle hole and screwed it up tight against the Bob Jones 7mm spacer, and hopefully this is going to act as a clamp to stop the frames moving apart as I solder onto this rear spacer. So I'm going to use my cocktail stick trick again to solder a 12BA nut on the underneath side of that rear spacer. And I'm going to use my flat nose pliers again to hold that nut, get a good grip on it so that I can push the cocktail stick in to form the thread on it and get it so that it cuts a little shoulder on the shaft of the cocktail stick, and that will hold the nut flat against the spacer. Now when I solder this, I'm running the risk of unsoldering where the spacer is fixed to the PCB pads, and so I need to be very careful doing this. So put on some flux, and cut myself my usual little salami slices of solder. And when I get the soldering iron on here, I'm going to have to be very careful that I don't push down with any force on the spacer, because once this solder's melted to solder the nut on, the solder is also going to have melted where the spacer's soldered to the PCB pads. So the whole thing is going to be in a sort of molten state, and it's just those frame spacers screwed on it that are holding it in place. So any pressure on here would likely push that spacer out of alignment at one side or the other. So I'll just nudge this out the way slightly so I can get around the back and make sure I've got the good fillet of solder that's flowed all the way around here. And once I'm happy with the soldering, I need to give this a good check, make sure that frame spacer is still in the place it should be, make sure that the nut is level, and then I'm just going to try and screw this cocktail stick in a little bit more, because when I come to put this next piece on the top, I'm going to use the end of the cocktail stick to align it centrally over that spacer. Because what has to happen is this piece now, this is going to form a little platform on which the tender drawbar is going to rest, and the hole in this needs to be aligned exactly over the nut so that the bolt can pass through this hole and up into the nut. So once I've cut that out, make sure the other bits I'm not using are safely stored away, and then just give a little file to remove any bits of cusp that are left on this part, paying special attention to the edges where they're going to butt against the underneath of the frame spacer. And once I'm happy that the edges are smooth, it's back with the flat nose pliers, and it's a case of folding these as close to 90 degrees as I can. But not to worry if I don't get them exactly 90 degrees, because I can bring in my Morn parallel action pliers and squeeze them up. Now, having the sides parallel is one thing, but I need to make sure that the centre section is perpendicular to the sides. It's very important because the drawbar is going to rest on the top of this platform. It needs to be level under the spacer. So if I bring in my other thin nose pliers, I can just tweak this around until I'm quite happy that they are right angles, and then just check the fit of this, slot it over the end of the cocktail stick, and that will then be centrally aligned. Now I've got to solder this on without unsoldering the cocktail stick and without unsoldering the frame spacer from the sides. So to help me do that, I've got a little coffee stirrer which I've found which is just exactly the right thickness, and I can chop off two little lengths of this coffee stirrer Just chop off the end of the cocktail stick so it doesn't get in the way, and then when I put this platform in place on the cocktail stick, I can put these chopped off bits of coffee stirrer on either side of it and push them in, and they will be just the right width to hold it in place. Again, using the Morn pliers like a hand vise now, I can grasp this and just tweak around with my tweezers, make sure that that platform is lined up and pushed down firmly as hard as it can be against the spacer. And with all these wedges and clamps, everything is going to be held perfectly rigid now. I could put some flux in there and put in some bits of solder, and with a bit of luck and a following wind, when I put in the soldering iron and melt this solder, and I am going to need a really good joint on this, so I'm going to have to dwell quite a long time to make sure the flux can carry that solder right into the joint. Hopefully nothing is going to move. With this kind of operation, it really is finding ways of clamping and holding everything so that you can make a good soldered joint. I don't want to put too much pressure on this, I don't want to squeeze it and distort it, but I need enough to hold it firm. So there's a second bit of solder on the other side. Hopefully you can see that in there, that little crumb. Then in with the iron, that will melt. Make sure the joint gets good and hot. You might be able to tell there's sort of solder just flowing round the nut, but because that cocktail stick's there, it's just remelting and it's holding it in place. And there we go. So I need to take these bits of packing away now and check from all angles that that joint is good and that the platform is level and straight and fixed. Right, get my tweezers and just give it a little tug, make sure it's not going to come away. Because I controlled the amount of solder that I used by chopping off that salami slice, I don't need to do any cleaning up there. Joints are perfectly neat. So I can remove the cocktail stick, and that's another little job done. I just need to wash the flux residue off this now, and then we can move on to the Simpson springs.